First of all, I would like to thank again the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and Ben-Gurion University for the invitation. It's an honor for me to be here, and it allows me to see Jerusalem, Israel for the first time. Thank you very much for that. And I discovered today that my birth year is the year of the creation of this center, 1973. So that was a nice coincidence. Also another coincidence, I wrote actually my PhD on the Bologna process at a center that has nearly the same name as your center. It's called CHEPS, Center for Higher Education Policy Studies at the University of Twente. So I think it's demanding to all of you before lunch to hear a third contribution now. And maybe also what you hear here is typical for the Bologna process. It is about diversity, right? And you hear very diverse interpretations here of the process and perspectives on the process. What I can offer you is a researcher's perspective. I'm a social scientist, and maybe some more overarching reflections on what you've already heard. If Norma is described as top-down, I think she would disagree, but that's what Marek said, and Marek as bottom-up, then I may be back and forth or, you know, cross-cutting in my presentation. This title, I didn't choose it myself, was given to me by the organizers who were maybe looking for a clear answer to all these foggy issues. And I'm trying to offer you some possible answers, but take them just as views from a different perspective, not as someone who thinks he has the answers. Okay, so that's how my presentation is structured. Some main characteristics of this process that you have heard in detail presented by Norma, and some factors that explain its dynamics. From my perspective, Marek has already also contributed to that. Then some more examples of country implementation, some examples of roads to Bologna, and finally some possible lessons for Israel. I'm really sorry to demand your attention so much. I hope to make it interesting. Main characteristics that make it confusing, as you noticed. It is an intergovernmental process. It is not an EU process. It's very important to remember that. It was initiated by ministers of higher education, and intentionally they did not invite the European Commission to their first meeting, which was even before Bologna in the Sorbonne. It was the French Minister of Higher Education who initiated it. Claude Allègre. But it became increasingly interwoven with EU policies and processes, so much that is today nearly identified with it by some. But it would never have become so influential if it had been initiated by the Commission, because higher education is at the heart of national competencies of all European countries, and they do not want to give it away to the European Commission. Yeah, they like to get some coordination assistance funding, which they need for their projects from the Commission, but they don't want to give away their say about higher education. It's a series of legally non-binding declarations. It's important to remember that, because as Marek stressed, some people like to blame Bologna for unpopular reforms, and they make it seem that you have to do something because of Bologna. Well, that may be the case, but not because it's legally binding. If it is binding, then it is a binding dynamics that emerged through the path-dependent processes between the national and international levels. It's very complicated processes where countries start to actually engage in fundamental reforms and set examples that they feed back into the European level. And from there, they spread and then other countries do the same, and suddenly it becomes binding and you can't get out anymore. So it's de facto binding, but not legally binding. And as you saw with all those meeting places, it's incremental process. Yeah, Norma, again and again, she came with new items on the list, and items coming back, being reinterpreted, being reintroduced, being brought back into attention. It's an evolving agenda. And even after the 2010 deadline, the process still goes on. And if it was implemented, it would be the end of evolution, as Marek said. It has an immense geographic dynamics and reach. From the 4 countries who initiated at the Sorbonne, that was pre-Bologna, those countries were France, Germany, Italy, and England. And then to now 47 European countries. Actually, there was a relaunch in Bologna because it was a big offense to the other countries that they hadn't been invited to Sorbonne. Actually, I interviewed Claude Allègre, and the French, they think of les autres grandes nations, yeah, and that's what they had in mind, Germany, Italy, and England. And you had to restart it, opening it up for the other nations, of course. And except Belarus, all Council of Europe countries are now a member, and I think that's the main formal obstacle to Israel joining it, that it's not a member of the Council of Europe. You have evolving stakeholder participation. New members were continuously added to the process. First of all, the European Commission in Prague already, because people realized they were needed mainly as a funding and also coordinating agency. And then you had the representative institutions of universities, of colleges, of students, later of employers, etc., coming in. What you also might have noticed, there's a certain vagueness about the commitments. Although the technical tools also seem very detailed, some of the key aims are very vague, like the rhetoric of the European higher education area. You know, what does it mean? Is it a European higher education system? Clearly not. You know, is it a big forum for discourse? Well, a bit more than that. It's something in between, and it's with many of these agreements, it's hard to spot it. The first degree has a minimum of 3 years, it was said. Yeah, but how many years then? It was not written down in Bologna. But then through these path-dependent processes, it turned out or seemed like 3-year bachelor degree and a 2-year master's was emerging as the norm. But it's not written down on the Bologna papers that it has to be a 3-year bachelor and a 2-year master's. There are other models. So with many of these things, don't take it at face value if something is communicated to you as the standard. There might be more options. And Bologna is characterized by tensions between aims, quite fundamental tensions. There's the tension between convergence and diversity. We want both. We want a diverse European higher education, but we want some convergence, some comparability at the same time, and tools are trying to balance the two. But where's the ideal point in the middle that balances diversity and convergence is up to renegotiation, up to discussion in all the Bologna seminars, within countries, within institutions, between countries. Cooperation and competition, we heard this morning, I think, by Professor David Newman, that it's not about competition. It surely is as well, I'm sure. Institutions are trying to be at the Bologna front to get some advantage maybe, but also without cooperation it doesn't work. And it's the same in Europe, there's this tension. Inward and outward orientation. You know, the dialogue within Europe assumes much energy. Still, I mean, we cannot say that Irish and German and Polonian higher education people know each other in detail, but we also should not forget to talk to the outside of Europe. It's a demanding process. What explains this immense dynamics of this process? Well, the initiation outside of the EU framework but then the use of the EU framework and the funding. If you can't beat them, join them. That's what the smaller countries thought after Sorbonne Declaration, you know. Better join the process and influence it. It's the only party in town. This is kind of the early sense of many higher education ministries, of many institutions. Something important was going on, something that was going to bundle European higher education reforms. So they wanted to be part of it. The potential to use alleged international trends or real international trends and commitments as support and arguments for national reforms. And you can play this card in different ways, right? You can play it to implement really needed reforms, but also to put your own priorities and say something is needed, as Marek said, because of Bologna. The vagueness and openness of the agenda allows for different boats to sail under the Bologna flag. That makes it attractive also. People can find their place within it. And of course there were and there are some real shared challenges in European higher education system. Like dropout was a big issue. The duration of studies, if traditional programs in many countries went up directly to master's level, people felt that graduates were too old. Funding, quality assurance. And as I said, there are these special dynamics resulting of this complex interaction between national, international, and local levels, which caused lock-in and also unintended effects. So another PhD student from France, she had this nice phrasing: when constraining links emerge from loose cooperation. This is what happened in Bologna. One example, for example, in France, directly before the Bologna process was started, there was a report called Attali report. And it recommended for French higher education that there should be a structure called 358, which was the length of the cycles. First degree after 3, second after 5, and doctorate after 8 years. And this document was certainly around at the Sorbonne conference. And later on, suddenly everyone thought that 358, that was the Bologna degree model, but it was actually a French discussion paper. Yeah, many countries then moved onto the 358 structure, and then it became kind of the norm. Yeah? This is what I mean by lock-in and unintended effects. And something like that might happen in Israel. If Ben-Gurion University sets some standards, it's their interpretation of Bologna, and it's maybe the first institution to implement it. Then other institutions would do it the same way to be compatible, and suddenly you have your Israeli system. And if you later discover it's maybe not, you know, the one that is most compatible with something in Europe, then it's already locked in. So these things happen easily in Bologna. So consequences of this are, first, I think it's inadequate. It's maybe too naive to speak of national implementation. It's better to speak of national policy formulation, of translation of European agreements to your local contexts. The nature of implementation in each higher education system depends on your higher education policy system, and there are myriads of policy styles in Europe. You know, some are very cooperative, very flat hierarchy. Others are more hierarchical. They do everything by law. Others do by decree. Others do by communication. And the ministry is more like a sparrings partner or providing a room for discussion like Konrad Adenauer Foundation does here. But what I found in my PhD is that a top-down process doesn't work in any higher education system. It's always a form of negotiation in the shadow of hierarchy. This means there is a kind of Damocles sword of, you know, if you don't come to an agreement yourself, then we have to, you do it by law or by force. Yeah. It's hard to get an accurate picture of development and trends. Actually, I was part of 2 evaluations of the Bologna process across all 47 countries on behalf of the European Commission. And you can imagine how hard it is to to actually get an accurate picture across this number of countries on how certain aspects are implemented. And the fact is, you won't find any publication that gives you a concise picture across all these countries. That makes it so hard to navigate, you know. You can always try to get as much information as possible about the institution or country you are cooperating with, but you should always be aware that this is only one way of interpreting Bologna. Okay, I'm not sure the audience has the patience to listen to 4 other possibilities of implementing Bologna after all that that Marek has already said. Maybe just take home this message. I was going to show you how France did it, how Germany did it, how the Netherlands did it, and how England did it. Maybe I give you just very quick, maybe 2 sentences per country to get some idea. I mean, France initiated the Bologna process, and they were very concerned that their system was so complex that they couldn't explain it to anyone outside of France. They had so many degrees, and it was all very, how they say, franco-français. So they thought if they cut across this jungle, and they have 3 levels, licence, master, doctorat, and interestingly, they don't call it bachelor until today, the first degree. It could simplify things, but you know, in France, my experience is the degree jungle is still there, just below this superficial layer of simplification, because you can't simplify a complex country so easily. And key idea of Claude Allègre, whom I really value, he was a visionary, he was a geochemist, was we need the grade de master, because all the intelligent people go to the United States to do a master's, because there is no master's in France. So he wanted to have the master's. Yeah, you're surprised because there were, of course, the maîtrise, etc. But
because nobody does a master in the US.
Yeah, and PhD then. And that's also interesting because the second cycle in the original vision there, I have to contradict Norma, it was a master or a PhD. That was open actually at that point because Claude Allègre thought the third cycle should be integrated, masters and PhD. So that's how things moved in the Bologna process. Some original visions survived, others didn't, or others might come back later. Okay. What the French didn't fully succeed in, but what they wanted is overcome the divide between the universities and the grandes écoles. To some degree, they got some bridges. I could go on for that. There are 100 pages on France in my PhD, which you can download for free, but it would take too long. But basically, the grandes écoles are out of reach of the ministry, so they can just steer them by carrots, not by sticks. Germany. The idea of bachelor-master structure had been around for a long time before the Bologna process. So Bologna was seen as a window of opportunity by the German national government to finally do all this, what they had wanted to do for a long time. And they changed their national higher education law already before 1998. But the thing is, in Germany, as we have a federal system, the national government cannot implement a higher education reform. They have to get 16 ministers agree. And that's, of course, in Germany, a heritage of our experience with totalitarianism in the Nazi regime, that we don't want any responsibility, any power on education, which is such a sensible issue, to be centralized, because bad ideas could also be spread through that way. So what we have as a result is intransparency and quite some chaos between 16 Länder ministries and 16 higher education laws. So in Germany, depending on where the institution is situated, you're cooperating with, you will hear different things. But still, there are some overarching trends across Germany. And the most fundamental thing for Germany was to introduce a bachelor and a master's, which they didn't have. And as Marek said, I think maybe the Germans are the most critical people of the Bologna process until today. You hear very critical voices from academics, and if you cooperate with German academics, you will be astonished that they criticize their own reform and talk about it in such negative terms that you think, so why should we be convinced of cooperating with you if you are not convinced of yourself? But you should see it as a kind of a national sport or kind of, yeah, oddity. Yeah, and doesn't mean that everything is as bad as they demonstrated, and certainly not the academic quality, I think, which is out of question. The Netherlands, a small country that had a very easy and pragmatic approach to the Bologna process. The universities all said, we need that to be internationally understood. We want it, dear ministry, when do you give us our law? They negotiated it. All discussions were publicly available, downloadable on the net. All stakeholders were heard. In 2002, they had a new law, and everyone agreed to it, and the universities implemented it in 2002, all of them at a time. They were very pragmatic. They didn't overload it with too many issues. Curriculum reform they had done before. They just cut their programs that were 4 years up to the master's into 3+1. At universities, at Hogescholen, that's the colleges, they just converted their degrees to a bachelor after 4 years. Basically, that's it. I'm exaggerating a bit, but it's not complicated. But it also doesn't mean fundamental reforms. Yeah? England, very interesting. It's not UK I'm talking about, just England. Particularly strong skepticism towards EU policies aimed at standardization and regulation because, first of all, British universities believe in institutional autonomy, and secondly, what is this continental Europe, the continent, wanting to tell us? So they had very mixed feelings towards the Bologna process. They signed it very early on, but they thought that won't touch us because we have it all in place. They are following our example. But in England, later on, in 2002, they started becoming nervous because most of their master's programs had a length of 1 year. And most European masters have a length of 2 years. So they worried that their degree is starting to become seen as lightweight. But they depend on the 1-year masters because it's very attractive to overseas students to come for a 1-year's master's, which they can also afford, and not for a 2-year master's. Also, there was a trend in Europe towards program accreditation, which was seen as a step back in England, where they were already on institutional audits, etc. So, English actors, and I can add Irish actors, are influential in the Bologna process, particularly on QA issues. And they do many reforms which resonate with Bologna, but they don't talk about Bologna. I think 80% of British academics, if you ask them, they say, what is Bologna? Although they have many of the tools in place, but on their own. Okay, I move on. Bologna, why is it relevant for Israel? I still had why is it still relevant for Israel? Because you might say, if you're so confused, Europeans, perhaps you better get to grips among yourselves before inviting us to join, right? Well, there is this increasing relevance of European higher education area as a frame of reference when partnering with European higher education institutions. You know that, also when attracting foreign students or engaging in student exchange. The Bologna effort, I put it with a question mark, is becoming a role model for other regions. You see signs of that. For example, a tuning Latin America process is happening. And some Bologna instruments are so interesting that they might become a gold standard. There's an interesting report by Cliff Edelman, Bologna for US Eyes, actually trying to take the lessons from Bologna and see what the US can learn from it. It's not a typical US perspective trying to learn from Europe, but there are very interesting points in there. It might be something that you can also read and profit from it. Because he's seeing all the good things in Bologna, Americans are positive, and trying to see how you could implement them in the US. You are already compatible. I don't know much about Israel, but your degree structure certainly is, it seems to me. And the modular structures, I think you also have in place already in many institutions. Use the Bologna language and tools in international cooperation. Employ tools pragmatically to support recognition and mobility, and pay attention that they do serve this aim. Because what happened in Germany is some academics reluctantly used ECTS or learning outcomes without really believing in it, and then what is the result? It doesn't actually support recognition and mobility, because if you don't do it to serve this purpose, it also doesn't serve this purpose. Just having ECTS doesn't in itself foster mobility. For example, if you define very big minimum module sizes of maybe 5 EC or more, and then you say below this size, no credit can be transferred, and then you have a partner university with smaller modules, you run into a problem if you are too rigid, right? So think of these issues. Do not underestimate the importance of non-technical driving forces like people, research, interest, and culture. Just 2 weeks ago, I was on a forum for dialogue between England and Germany, and all the academics and students who had engaged in exchange, they didn't do so because of Bologna or these tools, but because a researcher was interesting to them, because of a research question, because of the cultural experience. So don't forget that this is still the driving force. Lessons for policymakers, and then I have some for academics, and then that's it. I don't know what is planned in Israel, if the ministry is planning to kind of steer the process, but if it does, these are just some lessons that I drew from the European experience. Invest resources in monitoring European developments broadly and critically, so that you don't fall in a trap of taking something for granted. Invest time and resources in national communication and discussion on Bologna, and use broad stakeholder consultation. And I show you the different dimensions. Very important, the dialogue within subject areas, history, mathematics, music, within Israel, among themselves, so that you don't get incompatible implementation in the subjects. In professions like engineering, law, psychology, often particularly tricky because professions have their own rules and regulations. Between academia and employers, because students should be employable. If you have a diploma supplement, if employers aren't interested or it's in a way they don't use it, what's the use of it? With students, between higher education institutions and between universities and colleges. Otherwise, you can't use the process to get dialogue between these two types of institutions and permeability. Strive for national consensus in as many issues as possible, because if there is resistance under the surface, it pops up later. That's what we have in Germany. And make the consultation process and policy decisions very transparent, and do not overload the reform with too many ambitions and issues. That's the Dutch lesson. Better a pragmatic and easy start with a few key items, and then you can load on more issues later if the first reforms are settled. Otherwise, academics get tired of it, they find it overly complicated, and they don't see the use of it. For institutions, strong institutional leadership is needed. Otherwise, actually, administration takes over leadership. And then they look at all these Bologna transcripts and blueprints, and it becomes so bureaucratic, and then they make you, implement every level of qualifications, framework, etc., and just look to the letter. So institutional leadership is needed. Communicate the aims of certain methods. Why the use of learning outcomes? Why ECTS? Don't forget why you do it. Do not leave sight of compatibility with outside institutions. And assume institutional responsibility for the program quality, otherwise you get too much external control. And invest effort in program partnerships for student mobility and recognition, because even with Bologna, the experience so far is that free-floating mobility without institutional partnerships, it's still an ideal, right? It's not that just because of his ECTS your credits are recognized if there's not an agreement at institutional level to recognize it. Lessons for academics. Use Bologna's opportunity for your curriculum reform. I think that was Marek's lesson 2. Use a proactive reform approach to reform. Don't endure it. You know, that's what many German professors did, also French professors. They thought the reform might go away. It's just something happen at another level, and then after 10 years they maybe realize they can't escape it, and then they haven't designed it in the way they wanted it, and it's too late. So better use it proactively. You can still shape it in the initial phase. Question where directives come from. Are they from university leadership? Are they from the ministry? Are they from Bologna? These things can be distinguished. You know, if something comes from university leadership but contradicts Bologna, discuss it with university leadership. Be critical of the multi-level nature of the process and adjust where needed. Seek the discussion in your discipline and jointly develop orientation standards. In England, they are called benchmark statements. They are not prescriptive, they are outcome-oriented, and they describe what is expected of graduates at the levels in your discipline or your program area. And seek the continuous dialogue with students. So, to conclude, I would like to offer as a contribution to the library of your new Bologna Training Center.
Thank you very much.
This book on the change of degrees and degrees of change in Europe.
The title is amazing. Yeah. Change of degrees and degrees of change.
And if you Google that, change of degrees, you can download it for free also. And this is on, well, bachelor master degrees in Bologna. It's the microscopic perspective. It's a complement to that.
Thank you
and
very
then
much.
These are some questions maybe for summing up discussion that you can read yourself.
Thank you.